Good morning, everyone. So, my name is Luke Metzger. I'm the Executive Director of Environment Texas. Our mission is to protect the natural world. And we are experiencing today in Texas a boom in new data centers. And today we're going to evaluate what the impacts are to our electric grid, to water, to pollution. In this discussion brought to you today by Environment Texas and the League of Women Voters of Texas. And we know that from video streaming to storing photos in the cloud to using AI for research, our society is growing increasingly dependent on data centers, and they're helping us in a lot of ways. But a lot of the uses are pretty trivial or even dangerous. Data centers are growing rapidly in Texas. We're expected to be number one in the world for them by 2030. And that comes with a big strain on our resources, our energy, our water, our land, our air, and our climate. Data centers currently operating or under construction in Texas will use as much electricity as the nation of Norway. Meanwhile, opposition to data centers is growing. Cities have some power to regulate data centers through zoning and extension of utility services. Counties don't have zoning authority, but can decide whether to grant tax exemptions. In North Texas, in Hood County, leaders recently rejected a proposal to pause data center construction after a state senator threatened legal action. At the state level, lawmakers last year passed Senate Bill 6, which gives ERCOT the power to cut power to data centers during emergencies. But we need to do much more to protect our natural resources and communities. And we're joined today by an esteemed panel to discuss both some of the problems that data centers are posing to Texas, as well as some of the solutions. And we have joining us Quentin Good, a policy analyst for Frontier Group, who authored a report last year called Big Data Centers, Big Problems, the Surging Environmental and Consumer Costs of AI, Crypto, and Big Data. Dr. Margaret Cook, Vice President, Water and Community Resilience for the Houston Advanced Research Center, who authored Thirsty Data in the Lone Star State, the impact of data center growth on Texas's water supply. And finally, Augusta Gillespie Miller, Special Advisor for Energy and Utility Partnerships, and Amanda Sachs, Manager for State Policy, both with Rewiring America, which last fall released Homegrown Energy, How Household Upgrades Can Meet 100% of Data Center Demand Growth. So to kick us off, we're going to start off with Quentin Good, and we'll have each presenter go, and then we'll have hopefully plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So feel free to start entering those your questions in the Q&A box. Quentin, take it away.
Thank you, Luke. Give me just a moment here to get my screen share going. All right, you all should be seeing my slideshow. Good. Great. Well, yeah, I'm going to talk about a little bit of an overview of the different types of environmental and public health impacts data centers can have, not only in Texas, but what we're seeing around the country. As Luke mentioned, my name is Quentin Good. I'm a policy analyst with Frontier Group. Frontier Group is a nonprofit policy think tank that is a part of the Public Interest Network, and we work on ideas to help make the world a healthier and more sustainable place. And my focus over the last year has really been on data centers and how that could be impacting the environment. Um, Great. So as Luke mentioned, we did release a report in January of last year called Big Data Centers, Big Problems. This was a white paper we released to try and wrap our heads around the big picture of this issue and to sort of figure out, as this was an emerging problem, how we would approach it. Um, and this is such a fast evolving issue. I will say, even January 2025, a lot of the stuff that's in the report is already out of date because things are changing so quickly. But there were some key findings that I think are still relevant. So we found at the time that data centers were already slowing down the transition to clean energy from their perceived or real energy demands. But another kind of big picture thing that I'll show you on the next slide is that the projections for increased energy demand from data centers, they vary a lot from a lower range to a higher range, and they're very uncertain because we don't really have reporting from data centers on exactly how much electricity or water they're using. And so a lot of these estimations are bottom-up estimates that are based on complicated math equations for how many servers are in the data center and how many data centers we think they are and the different technology that they might be using. So there's a lot of uncertainty around these estimations. But despite that, essentially what we saw was around the country, utilities and grid operators were planning for a big increase, and we're starting to see delays in power plant closures as well as plans to build new fossil fuel power plants. So here on this slide, I have two graphs that I think are very illustrative. The one on the left is a collection of data center demand projections from late 2024. More demand projections have come out since then, but they all kind of fall within this range. And if you can't see the numbers on the graph, that's okay. Really, the shape is kind of the important thing that I want to point out here. Some of the data center demand projections going out to 2030 have us using as little as about 200 terawatt hours of energy nationwide on data centers, while others are twice as high. So it's a really, really big range. And there's a lot of room for error trying to figure out where we're actually going to land on that curve. Um, the one on the right is a really helpful historical example of, what this can look like over time. These two graphs are not comparing apples to apples, but the one on the right is called the NERC fan. And this is a collection of projections from NERC from the 70s, where the line on the top of the curve was their projection for how fast they thought energy demand was going to grow in 1972. And each year, they progressively reduced their projections for how fast energy demand was going to grow because there was a lot of things happening in the market that they didn't foresee. Improvements in energy efficiency. People didn't need multiple appliances in their homes, and so basically they were overestimating and had to reduce their projections every year. And this did have big impacts um, in the energy sector. So, for example, a lot of utilities around the country invested heavily in new infrastructure. A lot of it happened to be nuclear plants to meet this perceived demand that actually never materialized. And so one example was, Washington Public Power Supply earning the nickname Whoops after they defaulted on billions of dollars of bonds from trying to build nuclear plants that were abandoned or never even built. Um, and obviously, there's consumer impacts here, but one of the things that I'm going to focus on is the environmental impacts of these potential overinvestments in fossil fuel infrastructure. So, we've actually done some additional research since the report and found that 15 power plants around the country that were scheduled to be closed have had their closure dates delayed exclusively to meet the demands of data centers. So these are mostly coal-fired power plants, so not necessarily as relevant to Texas, but still something to be looking at. Um, the 15 power plants that had delayed closures total up to about 16 and a half gigawatts of capacity. They emitted 64 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions in 2023. And they emitted some other harmful air pollution, a lot of other harmful air pollution, including um, SO2 and nitrous oxides, particulate matter, and ozone forming pollution. As Luke mentioned, ERCOT is expecting lots of growth like this in Texas. This is the current ERCOT adjusted large load projection from their website, the graph on the right. And it shows that ERCOT is expecting data centers as well as cryptocurrency mines to increase by about 32 gigawatts from today in the next 5 years. They expect it to um, reach a total of 78 gigawatts for data centers. And there's also, so really the question here is we're going to have all of this growth. So how are we going to meet it? Are we going to meet it in Texas by building new fossil fuel plants? Are we going to meet it by building new renewables? The bright side is that Texas is really big on renewables, and a recent Enverus report reported that ERCOT planned to add 100 gigawatts of solar and battery by 2030. But really, the question is whether that's feasible with what's going on in Texas. Around the country, we've actually seen, increased cancellations of renewable energy projects. So it'll be important to meet this increasing demand that we're able to deploy new renewable energy resources. I want to take a moment also to talk about the environmental impacts of diesel generators and how that could potentially be a wrinkle in the Texas market specifically. Data centers really strive to operate 24/7, 365. Within the industry, they call it the five nines, which refers to 99.999% operational uptime. So basically, just always being operational. And when you have stress on the grid, that might not always be possible without the use of backup generators. So all data centers keep some amount of backup power, and the preferred source is diesel generators. Usually, data centers will have dozens of these, basically enough to power the entire data center to power a mid-sized city. Um, the way the regulations around these diesel generators currently work is that um, data centers are limited to 100 hours of runtime annually. However, there's no runtime use if they're able to define it as an emergency under federal standards. So, in some cases, they're able to get temporary permits to run above the run hour limitation for their diesel generators. In Texas, this could happen if data centers or crypto mines are asked or compelled to participate in demand response programs when the grid is experiencing stress. They could be compelled or asked to reduce their load on the grid, and they might be able to also put some of that power basically on diesel generators without any run hour limitations. And diesel generators are very dirty. They emit a lot of the air pollution I was talking about earlier, NOx and SOx and PM2 and all of that, PM 2.5 and all that bad stuff. Um, so this could be a complication where demand response might be a really useful tool in Texas to make sure that, data centers aren't straining the grid or, causing bigger problems. But at the same time, we have to be careful that we're not just offsetting that to high amounts of pollution from diesel generators. I'm going to quickly touch on a couple other concerns. Really quickly, because there's actually not much research on either of these issues, and I think that there needs to be more, but we know that there are impacts, and it's worth noting that we should do more research on these things so we can understand them better. One is noise. Granbury, Texas, I think has become sort of infamous for having a lot of people who are having health problems from the noise of a nearby crypto mine. Um, Data centers basically can emit a constant hum that's about the decibel level of a chainsaw. And there are ways to put up walls and sort of reduce that amount of noise. There are ways to, add setbacks to make sure they're far enough away from property lines so that they're not harming people. But we have to make sure we do that. Another interesting element of this is not all the noise that they make is audible. Data centers emit low frequency noise that's below the frequencies our ears can hear. And those vibrations still run through our body and can affect our health and well-being in pretty serious ways. There's an acoustic scientist and a YouTuber named Ben Jordan who did a video on this recently, and I think he's going to be doing a peer-reviewed scientific article or paper on the noise impacts of data centers. So that's a really interesting area that we should be researching. Another area that we don't have as much information on, but undoubtedly there is some impact is the land use. They take up lots of land, and to the extent that you're painting paradise and like putting up a parking lot, there's going to be some impacts on local wildlife or just alternative land uses. Like we could be using some of that land for state parks or just leaving it as an open space. And of course, with the noise affecting humans, that's probably also going to affect the local wildlife. But again, more research needs to be done on that particular impact. That was all I had for my overview. I didn't share citations throughout my presentation just due to the nature of the presentation, but if you are interested in any of the data that I shared or any of the citations, feel free to email me at this email address.
Great, thanks, Quentin. And we'll let's see, there's starting to be some questions coming in. We'll get to those after each of the speakers concludes. So now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Margaret Cook, if you're ready.
Sure thing.
Oh, great. Well, welcome.
Hi, everybody. To remind, Margaret Cook, I work at the Houston Advanced Research Center, which is a nonprofit in the Woodlands area focused on sustainability. We look at water, energy, air, and climate resilience issues. And obviously, data centers are one of those things that hits all of those issues. And making sure that you can see the slides, Luke.
Yes, yes,
okay,
we can.
Great. Fantastic. Okay, I'll keep going. So just continuing on what Quentin was talking about, data centers are coming to Texas and they're coming in full force. This is the figure an animated figure from formerly the National Renewable Energy Lab, now National Lab of the Rockies, showing data centers, existing data centers, developing data centers in prospective markets, and how that's going to grow in Texas over time. And they're choosing Texas because we have land availability, we have relatively cheap power, we have a whole lot of fiber. All of these lines on the figure are also fiber. And then they're choosing sites based on more detailed information like floodplain, water availability, proximity to labor, and then increasingly zoning issues, and where they're able to get at site access. And just to drill down a little bit deeper, as of September 2025, this is where data centers were concentrating in Texas, which is one of our biggest hubs is the Dallas area. Nearly half of the data centers in Texas are in the Dallas area. And then also in the rest of the Texas Triangle, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston are also big hubs. Austin is a techie area. San Antonio and Houston are business areas. They can connect into those networks. And then West Texas, El Paso, North Texas have a lot of land availability. So those are part of those siting decisions. And Quentin also mentioned that there are not a lot of good data sources for the amount of energy or water or resources that data centers are using. A lot of times that's behind an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, or something of that sort. And so we are struggling with transparency on this issue. And the state has been moving towards that with a survey that they're working on. However, in the meantime, we don't have any information on this. So HARC used an estimate for water demands of 95 gallons per megawatt hour, which is developed by the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab through their studies of cooling systems on data centers and what's active right now. And use that to assess what the water demand could be in Texas. And data centers use water directly on site for cooling, depending on the type of data center, the size of that data center, the type of cooling technology they use. That amount will vary, but on average, 95 gallons per megawatt hour on site for the cooling itself. That's the direct water use. And then they also have wastewater. If there's evaporation from that cooling system, there'll be blowdown. So the remaining water that gets saltier and saltier and saltier as other water evaporates, then has to be taken away, refreshed with cleaner water. And that is called blowdown. It gets too briny. And then there's an indirect water use associated with data centers because they use so much electricity and because our grid in Texas has a lot of power from steam electric, power plants from natural gas combined cycle power plants, from power plants that use water for cooling as well. There's an indirect water demand associated with data centers too. And so we also calculated that from the existing information that's reported about water use for power plants. And individually, some data centers may have smaller impacts on communities, especially if they're smaller data centers. Larger data center facilities will have bigger impacts on the communities that they're next to, especially if those are smaller rural communities that don't see those types of water uses in their area. And then collectively, because of this rapid growth rate, we're seeing a lot of growth on Texas water demands, and that could send a shock to our system as well. So as I mentioned, there are factors that influence how water is used at a data center. There's the cooling type, the size of the data center, the type of the data center, and the computing equipment that needs cooling. All of those can impact the amount of water that's used. And on the right there, I show some example cooling technologies that are used in data centers. Cold plate, which is cooling the hottest components on the data center through a cold plate attached to the computing equipment. One phase cooling, which is using an oil-based liquid to cool the equipment. And then that oil-based liquid is, heat is transferred from that oil-based liquid to a device that can remove the heat from that loop into the atmosphere. And the same would happen in that cold plate cooling system. Two-phase cooling, where there's a dielectric liquid or a chemical liquid that can do a phase change. So that's how it cools the system. And then again, is the heat is removed from that internal cooling mechanism with an external heat rejection equipment device, like a water chiller or air chiller or something of that sort. That external cooling mechanism is where you'll have a lot of that water demand. From a water chiller, for example, is very water intensive compared to other devices or other pieces of equipment. And that will impact the amount of water that is used at that facility. Air cooling or dry cooling would be waterless technology, and then you can also have hybrid systems that are a combination between the two. One caveat to using an air cooling or dry cooling system is that it may be noisier depending on how that's set up, and that can add to the concerns that Quentin was talking about earlier. This figure is similar to what Quentin was showing. There are two figures that ERCOT put out in April of 2025 to show the demand of energy that could increase on the grid. One was the estimate from the transmission and distribution providers, and one is ERCOT's scaled down estimate. The transmission and distribution providers were estimating how much they think the data centers could add to the grid, up to 78 gigawatts, as Quentin said. And then ERCOT scaled that back, knowing permitting timelines and how long it takes to get through the queue on the grid. And what they're saying is what they realistically think that they could add to the grid is that something closer to 22 gigawatts. But that doesn't mean that that other demand will just go away. We're seeing a huge shift to data centers having their own on-site power. So they're not just using the grid, they're building their own power plants, getting by that queue, not waiting for their turn to interconnect themselves and doing their own power, and then putting that power plant in the queue to be able to provide excess power later on. So in the meantime, they get to use all of that on-site power, and then later they could sell any excess power. And that, of course, has air quality implications in and of itself, depending on the power plants that they choose to have on site. And of course, water impacts too, depending on that power plant's cooling technology. So if they're choosing renewables that have no water demand for cooling, then we wouldn't see an indirect water demand associated with that facility. But if they choose a power plant that does have water for cooling, a natural gas combined cycle power plant, a small modular nuclear reactor, something of that sort, depending on that cooling technology, they'll have an increase in their indirect water demand. So HARC estimated the 2025 total consumption based on all of that information that I just mentioned. And it's looking like data centers are already consuming almost 1% of water at a statewide level. And then if we go to 2030 and we see that increase up to 78 gigawatts of power on the grid, knowing those potential indirect water demands and the direct water demands, we could see up to almost 3% of additional water demand for Texas. And 3% doesn't seem like a huge number, but we are already going to be 10% short. So this is 3% on an already strained water system. And none of these demands, none of this growth that we're expecting is included in the existing state water plan. So we have data uncertainty. We don't know how much water is being used. We have this estimate. We don't know for sure. There's a lack of transparency. There's few published studies available. And then that growth that we're expecting over time that ERCOT has predicted, we don't have any estimates for what that could look like on the water system to be able to plan for that in our 5-year planning cycle. So it's not in our current 2022 plan. It's not in our 2026 to 2027 or 2026 regional plans that go in the 2027 state water plan. It would be in the next cycle if we get that data in time for the 2032 water plan. And municipalities who are dealing with these decisions in their own communities don't have the information that they need to make really informed decisions about their water system to make sure that they are getting the full cost of water and from data centers, and also ensuring that their community members, their ratepayers, are not paying for that increased water use. So we also make recommendations for reducing water demand and handling these additional costs. Water lean technologies, obviously reducing the water demand on site, reducing the fresh water demand with alternative water supplies, reducing the energy use on site so that there's less water needed for cooling because there's less energy used on site, or dry cooling, knowing the caveats of that as well. And also leveraging the investment that data centers are making and making sure that they're not just investing in their facility, but they're investing in the community. That includes the water infrastructure that they'll be using, and making sure that that cost is not passed on to all ratepayers, that they are covering that themselves. Incentives for water lean strategies, incentives for water saving ordinances, looking to the energy sector on what they're doing for large loads. All of those are policy recommendations that could be considered to help reduce this water demand, or at least handle it better, and make sure that we are better equipped to ensure that all Texans have access to clean water.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Cook. Now I'd like to turn it over to Augusta Gillespie from Rewiring America.
Hi, everyone. Excited to be here today. We're here to talk a little bit about our Homegrown Energy Report, which is really a solution-oriented perspective that's focused on bringing energy investments from hyperscalers and data center developers directly into communities. Before I dive in, I just want to note, we recognize that this is one solution. It's not going to address every concern, certainly that Quentin and Margaret just raised, where it's really focused on energy and affordability. But we think it can be a really powerful tool and a important part of a portfolio of solutions to address the impacts of data center development. So I'm going to start today talking a little bit about households. Households have historically been seen as passive energy consumers. They, come in and they use the energy they need to live their lives. We're in this moment of tremendous energy growth, and that's changing the dynamic, or it has the opportunity to change the dynamic, enabling households to become part of our energy infrastructure and really contributing to the overall health and performance of our grid. So as Quentin mentioned, the projections on energy use can vary, but based on our sources, we've seen U.S. electricity demand from data centers is projected to grow by about 90 to 200 gigawatts from a capacity perspective. But we also see that somewhere between 50 to 100% of that demand, depending on where we land on the scale there, can be met by direct upgrades in homes nationwide. And so, when we say that, we mean things like deep energy efficiency measures, electric resistance to heat pumps, central AC to heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, solar, and storage. So as an example, hyperscalers could meet about 33% of their capacity needs by subsidizing heat pumps in the 21 million homes that use inefficient electric resistance heating today. That's about 30 gigawatts of capacity that is just being used by those old inefficient baseboard heating systems. This is a look at a map where if we took, those interventions, central AC to heat pump, space heating, electric resistance to a heat pump, or water heating, electric resistance to a heat pump, and optimized for what's going to have the greatest impact in each state. The colorful dot here is the potential capacity that could be unlocked through those interventions, and the black circle is the demand that is projected in that state. So, you'll see in some places the opportunity exceeds the data center demand. In some places, it just about meets it, and in some places, it's not quite enough. So it'll vary by state, but I think needless to say, there's a lot of opportunity just in this one kind of infrastructure upgrade around space and water heating. If we then look at the potential for rooftop solar and storage, we could unlock another 100 plus gigawatts of capacity across the country. So looking at a similar map, you can see a really significant amount of demand here, data center demand addressed through these residential upgrades. And this accounts for, some estimates from our data team around suitable roofs and things like that, focused on single family homes, I should say. And so, you can imagine you start stacking these interventions, and it really does create a significant impact on how we think about where we're getting the capacity to serve the data centers and how households can be a meaningful part of that solution, as opposed to things like, behind the meter natural gas and other new generation that is popping up or proposed to pop up. And so that might all sound good, but the question, of course, comes to how expensive is this going to be, and is it practical, and would anyone actually pay for this? Well, it turns out, if we look at subsidizing about 50% of the upfront cost for an electric resistance to heat pump upgrade, or 30% of a rooftop solar and storage upgrade, it's going to cost somewhere between, $350 to $375 per kilowatt year. That's very comparable to what a hyperscaler would pay to build and operate a new gas power plant, which is around 315 right now, but those estimates have been going up recently given the increase in demand. And this isn't just about unlocking that capacity. It could create somewhere between 600 to over 1 million jobs a year for contractors and electricians across the country. And there are also tremendous bill savings and climate benefits associated with avoiding new generation and making our grid more efficient. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Amanda to jump in and talk about some of the policy-related levers we could take to seeing this come into action.
Thanks, Augusta. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Sachs. I'm the State Policy Manager at Rewire America. Given the information presented so far, I'll be talking about the policy options that could help states prioritize households as data center growth continues. And like Augusta explained, our homegrown energy work starts with the simple reality that electricity demand is rising fast, infrastructure takes years to upgrade, and households are obviously feeling the cost pressure. So we're telling hyperscalers and other large load customers to think creatively about meeting this growth. And we are pushing to deviate from the build more stuff and socialize the costs default. We see these three policy levers that make homegrown energy real. Firstly, we need energy affordability. For our purposes, this means making home energy upgrades like solar and storage and heat pumps pencil out. And some of these policy options are long-term funding from large energy users to cover some or all of the upfront costs of these upgrades, cutting red tape that's been inflating the soft costs and delays, especially for solar and battery storage, low-cost financing options so that households can spread the upfront costs of these upgrades, hopefully with incentives also stacked to help cover a good amount of the upfront cost. And rate design like time of use pricing that lowers peak energy demand overall and rewards off-peak usage. And then we want to unlock the ability for households to benefit from the building that they live in being a grid asset. So the heat pumps, smart thermostats, batteries, storage, if these are all coordinated as virtual power plants, this is a real asset. But today, a lot of that value doesn't reliably count in planning or markets and isn't given its really, households aren't being paid for the value that they could reasonably contribute. So we need to, through policy, recognize distributed energy resources as real capacity with performance standards, pay households for the verified grid value through demand response programs, and set clear targets around what share of peak should come from distributed portfolios and how many homes by X date. The third lever is accountability, and that's been the focus of a lot of the presentation so far. Data centers are driving a large share of new demand, and we need to ensure that new costs from infrastructure upgrades to the grid don't fall on household bills as a backstop. So in policy, states can require large new loads to bring their own clean energy or fund capacity, including through residential upgrades that deliver verified peak reduction. Next slide, please. This is a table with some policies that have been proposed, enacted, or killed in Texas around data centers. And I pulled this from the We Build Progress Data Center Laws and Regulations database. So what we've seen so far is that Texas is already responding to data center growth, acting on some of this accountability and grid reliability. But the state needs stronger policies and to prioritize household-facing capacity investments that will reduce the long-run infrastructure needs. So yeah, you can look back at this when we share the slides, but there's Texas Senate Bill 6 that was signed in June 2025 that expands regulatory oversight for large loads and ERCOT, covering the planning and interconnection, creating emergency tools to curtail or disconnect large loads when there's really tight supply conditions. There's also some tax exemptions for qualifying data centers through comptroller certification that is tied to thresholds like facility size, job creation, capital investment, and separately House Bill 591 in June 2023 created a tax exemption for gas that would otherwise be vented or flared if it's consumed near the well. And that policy can intersect with on-site power for digital infrastructure. And you can see the local political dynamics are changing as well. In Fort Worth, there was a roughly $750 million data center zoning change in September 2024, despite organized opposition and a zoning commission rejection, signaling there's a strong development momentum even when there's friction, but this friction is not likely to stop anytime soon. What Texas hasn't done yet is systematically ask, what is the lowest cost way to serve this growth? Is it always transmission and gas peakers, or can aggregated residential capacity shave enough peak to defer infrastructure? And in many markets, a well-run virtual power plant can deliver capacity at a fraction of the cost of new peaker plants, and a fraction of the time, which is also very important. Next slide, please. So one of the really exciting policies we've seen is called the Power Act in Illinois. And it attempts to bundle a lot of different solutions in one bill. It was introduced last month and would set statewide standards for hyperscalers, covering clean energy procurement, utility cost responsibility, and community impacts. And at a high level, it aligns with what we've been talking about. It creates guardrails so that data center energy needs costs don't shift to households. And historically, large industrial loads have often benefited from preferential rates, while fixed costs migrate to the residential customers. And this bill tries to rebalance that equation. The bill would give data centers that demonstrate responsible clean energy leadership faster connection to the grid. Data centers would be required to show how they'll power their operations with new clean energy, and calibrated to their size, all data centers would pay annually into a restricted fund that goes towards environmental justice grant projects and energy affordability. And the Power Act is pushed by the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, and recommend looking into that. Are we okay on time, Luke? Okay, let's see.
You bet.
Sweet. So the question becomes, how do you operationalize this? For policy mechanisms that unleash distributed energy resources and virtual power plants, we can set clear deployment targets, like the percentage of peak demand met by distributed solutions. We also need to reduce the cost of household upgrades that protect the grid by cutting red tape and establishing durable funding programs. We need to require regulators and utilities to fully value and prioritize distributed energy resources in system planning and procurement, and expedite pathways to accredit their capacity and grid services. The key advantage here is speed when it comes to getting the data centers on board. Residential portfolios can often be deployed in 1 to 2 years, where a new transmission line can take 7 and even up to 10 years. And a new gas plant can take 4 to 6. Whereas a portfolio of smart thermostats and heat pumps can be aggregated in months. If residents are interested, hyperscaler contributions can plug into frameworks that treat homes like dispatchable capacity with contractual performance. This can be through local benefits agreements that are agreed upon with the community, large load tariffs. So riders on the bill funding electrification and virtual power plant enablement with low and moderate income set-asides, interconnection agreements to require a capacity offset portfolio aligned with peak impacts. And we want performance-based incentives also. So this is more of the carrot and stick approach, where tax breaks or expedited approvals are contingent on verified residential capacity outcomes. And second to last slide. This is more policy mechanisms to leverage large loads. We can require large load customers to fund grid modernization efforts, maybe through peak demand charges, which support things like VPP programs, targeted bill relief, electrification. There's also this bring your own capacity idea to front load offsite distributed energy resource procurement and elevate DERs as the preferred resource in interconnection planning for all new large loads. And then there's bring your own distributed capacity, which would require large loads to procure capacity offsets upfront by contracting for offsite distributed portfolios like the aggregated heat pumps, thermostats, batteries. And for that, there would need to be clear performance requirements. There's also when utilities study interconnection impacts, require them to evaluate the DER portfolio as a preferred option, and maybe have them do that ahead of traditional upgrades so that you can shrink costs and accelerate timelines. The message here being, if you drive peak, you help pay to manage that peak. And next slide. Really appreciate your time today. Overall, the right mix of policy will vary by state, different markets, different constraints, different politics. But the states that get this right won't just protect households, they'll create the fastest pathway to load growth without grid crises. And the principle should hold, don't make households bankroll load growth, and make load growth help bankroll the fastest, cheapest capacity we have. And residential peak demand reduction is often the cheapest form of capacity available on the system.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. So now I'm going to open it up to questions. I have a few to kick things off, and we already have a number in the Q&A box. But the first question is, it's estimated that I think there's more than 464 data centers already in Texas. We already can stream videos on Netflix. We can already, search on ChatGPT. Why do we need so many more data centers? I don't know. Quentin, do you want to take that?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question because as you're pointing out, we can already do a lot of the stuff we want to do with our digital lives, and we can already interface with AI and have this meeting with low latency and all of that. So why do we need all of these new data centers? And I think it boils down to, it's to do the stuff we're not doing yet. It's to create and build and train new AI models that could do a lot of different things. And many of the companies behind this may not actually have an exact idea of what those models will look like or what they'll contribute to society. But it really kind of comes down to the ambition to lead the world in AI.
Great, thanks. Okay, so then in the chat, we have one question is about, we're often hearing that some of these data centers are using closed loop systems for water. So Dr. Cook, perhaps you could, I don't know if there's an estimate of how many are using closed loop versus open loop. And you talked about this, but maybe you can kind of briefly say again, is a closed loop system clearly better than an open loop?
There aren't estimates for how many facilities are using closed loop technology. There's no data set in Texas that tracks or nationally that tracks the cooling technologies at data centers or the amount of water that they're using. The PUC survey that I mentioned, the Public Utility Commission survey that's meant to track the water use, is an attempt to get that information from active data centers or those that are in the interconnection process with the PUC, with ERCOT. So the ones that are loads that would be part of the grid, as we mentioned before. So that doesn't necessarily capture every data center, and it doesn't capture the ones that are planned and haven't gone through that process. So we won't get the forecast, but we'll get a little bit more information on the current use. But that hasn't happened yet, and so we still don't have that information currently. However, a closed loop system is meant to be more water efficient. as I mentioned, with those technologies that I included in the presentation, they all have that sort of inner technology where there's some mechanism that's cooling the servers, and then that fluid that's in that system has to be cooled down itself to be able to be recirculated. We can't just perpetually heat something up and expect it to still be able to cool. You have to recirculate. So something has to pull the heat off of that internal loop. And that's that heat rejection technology that I mentioned. Um, and so it depends on what kind of heat rejection technology that they pair that closed loop with as to how much water or how much energy might be associated with that cooling system. So if it's a bunch of water chillers, we're going to have a system that uses a good deal of water comparatively. But if they have a bunch of air chillers, there's going to be a pretty negligible water demand. If they have a hybrid system, it'll be something in between. There are various types of technologies that can be that external heat rejection technology, a cooling tower or something like that could also be used. So that will dictate how much water is being used, which is why I also mentioned if you're being told it uses a closed loop system or it uses XYZ, I would push back and say, how much water does it use? Because that's the information that you actually want. And anything else is a lack of transparency. How much water does it use? How are we paying for that water? How are we supplying that water? That's the information that a community should be able to have access to make sure that their system is well taken care of and actually planning for the future.
Great, thank you. So one question is, don't we already need households to make, upgrades to efficiency, et cetera, just to meet our existing challenges of climate change, not accounting for this huge growth? And I guess the same, question could be true for all the new planned utility scale solar and batteries. Don't we need those to actually offset existing, polluting sources of energy? And then a kind of separate question, and perhaps this is for either Augusta or Amanda, but are any of the solutions that you all talked about, can we do them at the local level? If there's a municipally owned utility like Austin or San Antonio could they have such like peak demand charge, et cetera, for their industrial customers like that?
Yeah, I can jump in on the first, then I'll pass it to Amanda. Yes, I mean, Rewiring America was founded on the premise that we need to electrify over 1 billion machines in residential homes. So yes, so this is definitely part of what we need to do. And I think one of the reasons we're advocating this as a solution related to data centers is because it is a way to accelerate that transition by attracting funding from large corporates who frankly have a lot of funding, and to make it more accessible, affordable, and easier for households to go ahead and make those changes. Electric resistance heating can sit in someone's house for 80 years before it needs to be replaced. So why would someone make a change unless they have access to, good materials and education about it and resources to make that change? There are obviously bill benefits and other things that will help those households, but there's a lot of inertia in the market. And so we see this as a great opportunity to move that forward.
I can jump in on the policy front. I wish I made a comparison table with the local, state, and both. But for large load tariffs, it's controlled by both state or local regulators. So that for investor-owned utilities on the state level, this would be a state public utility commission. And for the municipal or electric co-ops, this would be a local utility board. Or a local governance board for the electric co-ops. In terms of the interconnection agreements, this would be mostly state authorities having control over that. And performance-based incentives could be either through sales tax exemptions on the state level, property tax, investment credits, on the state level, and then for local, it would be fast tracking zoning and administrative approval. So both also have power over the performance-based incentives. And then with local benefits agreements, that would just be local through zoning approvals, development agreements, conditional use permits. That all would be negotiated with the local government.
Great, thank you. There's a question about transmission lines and how this fits into the data center question. There's a lot of opposition from landowners and others for some of the new 765 lines kind of going out to meet new demand for electricity. How does that play into this? Is there opportunity for common cause for some of these concerns? I don't know if anyone can. Quentin, maybe you could take that.
The question is, how can landowners kind of come together to oppose transmission?
Well, just more specifically, how do these issues overlap? The demand for data centers and the growth in transmission lines.
Well, basically, when ERCOT is facing this influx of data centers, they may need to invest in new transmission and distribution infrastructure to basically deliver the electricity to the new large load customers. And this can be this is mainly a consumer utility problem because some of the costs of those infrastructure upgrades could be passed on to ordinary utility customers like households and smaller businesses. Whereas typically the utility regulator will try to hold the large load customers responsible for 100% of those costs that are needed. But that may not always happen. I think with a lot of landowners, there are other issues with accepting transmission distribution infrastructure in terms of just the aesthetics of it and the other potential impacts on the value of their land from having it nearby. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. All right, we're almost out of time. I see there's one question about kind of the water use. I see Dr. Cook is. Oh, maybe she already answered the question, but can you answer? Often they're saying, "Oh, well, data centers don't use much more water than other types of commercial or industrial uses." What's the quick response to that?
Oh, I didn't provide a quick response. I provided a whole paragraph, but other industries have responded to the historical water use surveys and the data centers aren't. So we don't have the transparency that we need to actually address this issue. That's the first and highest point. If they would provide transparency collectively on the whole, not just one data center, but all of them, as they're coming online, as they're coming into communities, then we could actually have conversations about how much water they're using. But right now we have estimates and they're only as good as the data that we have, which is not a lot. And then on top of that, other industries already using water. Data centers are new. They're coming in as large water users, rapidly growing. We don't have information. We can't plan. Communities can't effectively negotiate. And they're potentially pushing other water users off of our systems or straining our aquifers, adding additional demand to a state that's, again, already short on water. So because we don't have enough water already, because we haven't been able to plan for these data centers effectively, and because they're not providing the information that we need, they're getting more scrutiny.
Great, thank you. Well, we're out of time. Thank you all for joining us today. We will post the recording of this webinar on our website, as well as the slides from the presenters. So look out for an email from us soon with links to all of that. And thank you so much. Have a great day. Oh, it's election day. If you haven't voted, go vote. Thank you.